The dust had barely settled on Fletcher Warren's 32nd birthday when he stood at the altar for the second time in his life, watching the church doors remain stubbornly closed while 200 guests shifted uncomfortably in their pews behind him. The year was 1881, and Jefferson, Texas, had seen its share of scandals, but Fletcher Warren was quickly becoming the town's most pitied bachelor, a man cursed by love or perhaps cursed by his own poor judgment in choosing women who could not commit. The first time had been 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1878, when Margaret Sullivan had disappeared the night before their wedding, leaving only a hastily scribbled note about catching the morning train to San Francisco with a traveling salesman she had known for all of 2 weeks. Fletcher had been 29 then, already considered past his prime for marriage by some of the older folks in town. But he had loved Margaret with the earnest devotion of a man who believed in the sanctity of promises. Her departure had left him hollow, a shell of the confident ranch foreman he had been, but time and work had slowly stitched him back together. Then came Catherine Price in the winter of 1880, a schoolteacher from Houston who had arrived in Jefferson with impeccable references, and a smile that could melt the frost off a December morning. She was educated, refined, everything Margaret had not been, and Fletcher had convinced himself that this time would be different. He had courted her properly, with flowers and Sunday dinners and long walks along the cypress-lined bayous that gave Jefferson its distinctive character. When he proposed on a mild February evening, she had said yes without hesitation, and Fletcher had allowed himself to believe that his luck had finally turned. But now, standing in the First Baptist Church on a sweltering July afternoon, with Reverend Thompson awkwardly clearing his throat every 30 seconds, and his best man, Samuel, gripping his shoulder with increasing force, Fletcher knew the truth before anyone came to confirm it. Catherine was not coming. His brother Marcus finally appeared at the church entrance, his face grim, and the slight shake of his head told Fletcher everything he needed to know. She had left town on the noon stage, heading east with a lawyer from Marshall who had been in Jefferson settling an estate. No note this time, no explanation, just an empty room at the boarding house and a wedding dress hanging in the wardrobe. Fletcher had walked out of that church with his head held high, refusing to show the town how deeply the blade had cut this second time, how the wound was not fresh, but rather a reopening of the same gash that had nearly destroyed him before. He had gone back to the Double W Ranch, the sprawling cattle operation he managed for the Whitmore family, and he had thrown himself into work with the kind of desperate intensity that worried his men and concerned his family. Months passed in a blur of cattle drives, fence mending, and long nights in the bunkhouse where he stayed even though he owned a small house in town. He avoided Jefferson proper except when absolutely necessary, and he certainly avoided any situation that might involve unmarried women. By the spring of 1882, Fletcher Warren had become a different man from the one who had believed in love and happily ever after. At 33, he was hardened, cynical, and entirely convinced that marriage was an institution designed to torture men foolish enough to trust in it. He was respected by his workers, valued by the Whitmores, and pitied by nearly everyone else in Jefferson, though no one dared say it to his face anymore. His younger brother Marcus had tried to set him up with various eligible women, but Fletcher had refused every attempt with increasing irritation. It was on a Thursday morning in late April when Fletcher rode into Jefferson to collect a shipment of barbed wire from the freight depot. The town was busy with its usual commerce, steamboats loading and unloading at the cypress log wharves that connected Jefferson to the rest of the world via the big Cypress Bayou. He guided his horse down Austin Street, nodding curtly to the merchants and townspeople who greeted him, when he noticed a commotion outside the Grand Hotel. A young woman stood on the wooden sidewalk, surrounded by several large trunks and hatboxes, arguing with a thin, nervous-looking man in a conductor's uniform. Even from a distance, Fletcher could see she was frustrated, her hands gesturing emphatically as she spoke. She wore a traveling suit of deep green that had seen better days, and her dark hair was partially escaping from beneath a simple bonnet. There was something about the set of her shoulders, the defiant tilt of her chin, that caught his attention despite his determination to remain uninvolved in other people's problems. "I paid for transport to Jefferson, and I expect my belongings to be treated with respect, not thrown about like sacks of grain," the woman was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the street. She had a slight accent he could not quite place, something Eastern but not quite refined enough to be Boston or New York. The conductor was shaking his head, backing away toward the freight wagon. "Lady, I delivered what I was paid to deliver. If some of your things got damaged, that is between you and the railroad company, not me personally." Fletcher should have kept riding. He had learned the hard way that involving himself in the affairs of women, especially strange women newly arrived in town, led nowhere good. But something about the situation rankled him. The conductor was clearly in the wrong, and the woman was alone with no one to advocate for her position. He found himself dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post before he had fully decided to intervene. "Is there a problem here?" Fletcher asked, approaching the pair with his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that was automatic despite his intentions to remain distant. The woman turned to face him, and Fletcher felt something shift in his chest, an uncomfortable sensation he immediately tried to suppress. She had striking features, not conventionally pretty in the way Catherine had been, but arresting nonetheless. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber brown, and they assessed him with an intelligence and wariness that suggested she had dealt with her share of difficulties. "This gentleman seems to believe that breaking a lady's belongings is an acceptable part of freight transport," she said, her tone acerbic but not hysterical. "I am attempting to explain that I will be filing a complaint with his supervisors." The conductor puffed up. "Now see here, there was no breaking of anything that I saw. Things shift during transport, that is just the nature of travel." Fletcher looked at the trunks more closely and noticed that one had a significant crack in its wooden side, and another had clearly been dropped at some point, its corner completely staved in. He recognized the conductor as Bill Hendricks, a man known for rough handling and a short temper. "Bill, these trunks look like they have been through a war," Fletcher said mildly. "The lady has a right to expect better treatment of her property." Bill's face reddened. "You going to take her side, Fletcher? You do not even know her." "I know damage when I see it," Fletcher replied, his voice remaining level but firm. "And I know the railroad has policies about this sort of thing. Maybe you should fetch Mr. Morrison from the depot office so we can sort this out properly." The conductor glared at both of them but seemed to recognize that he was outnumbered in terms of public opinion. Several other townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation, and Bill clearly did not want the attention. "Fine. She can take it up with Morrison. I am done here." He stalked back to his wagon and climbed up onto the seat with more force than necessary, snapping the reins and driving off down the street. The woman watched him go, then turned back to Fletcher with an expression that was equal parts grateful and suspicious. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Warren, Fletcher Warren." He replaced his hat and nodded politely. "I apologize for Bill's behavior. He should not have treated you or your belongings so poorly." "Delilah Vance," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was bold for a woman but not inappropriate. Fletcher shook it briefly, noting the calluses on her palm that suggested she was no stranger to work. "I appreciate your assistance, Mr. Warren. I am new to Jefferson, and was beginning to think I had made a terrible mistake in coming here." "Where are you from, Miss Vance?" Fletcher asked, though he immediately regretted the question. He did not want to get drawn into conversation, did not want to know her story or why she had come to Jefferson. "Philadelphia originally, though I have been living in St. Louis for the past 2 years. She gestured at her damaged trunks with a rueful expression. "I am here to take a position as assistant to Dr. Benjamin Cartwright. I am a trained nurse, or at least as trained as a woman can be in this modern age." Fletcher knew Dr. Cartwright, an elderly physician who had been treating the people of Jefferson for nearly 40 years. He had heard the doctor had been looking for help as his health declined, but he had assumed it would be a young man studying medicine, not a woman. Then again, female nurses were becoming more common, especially after their notable service in the war. "Dr. Cartwright is a good man," Fletcher said. "You will be well employed with him." "That is reassuring to hear." Delilah looked at her trunks and then at the hotel. "I suppose I should see about getting these inside and then find Mr. Morrison at the depot to file my complaint, though I confess I am not entirely sure how to move them myself." Fletcher should have excused himself and gone about his business. He should have tipped his hat, wished her well, and walked away before he got any more entangled in the affairs of this stranger. But he found himself saying, "I can help you get them into the hotel at least. I have a few minutes before I need to collect my freight." Relief crossed Delilah's features, softening them in a way that made her actually quite lovely. "That would be incredibly kind of you, Mr. Warren. I have been traveling for 3 days, and I am afraid my reserves of patience and strength are both depleted." Between the two of them, they managed to carry the trunks and hat boxes into the Grand Hotel's lobby, where the desk clerk assured Delilah that her room was ready. Fletcher could not help but notice how capable she was despite her obvious exhaustion, how she lifted and carried without complaint, working alongside him rather than standing by helplessly. When they had finished, she insisted on buying him coffee in the hotel's dining room as thanks, and Fletcher found himself accepting before his better judgment could intervene. They sat at a small table near the window, and Delilah removed her bonnet, revealing hair that was indeed attempting to escape its pins, creating a halo of dark curls around her face. She looked younger without the bonnet, probably no more than 24 or 25, and there was something in her expression that spoke of determination tempered by recent hardship. "You have saved me twice in the span of an hour, Mr. Warren," she said as the coffee arrived. "First from that dreadful conductor, and then from having to make multiple trips up and down the stairs with my belongings. I am in your debt." "No debt," Fletcher replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just common courtesy. Anyone would have done the same." Delilah raised an eyebrow. "My experience suggests otherwise, but I will accept your modesty." She sipped her coffee and studied him with those unusual eyes. "You seem like a man who works outdoors. Are you a rancher?" "Foreman at the W Ranch," Fletcher answered. "Been there near about 10 years now." "That sounds like satisfying work. Hard, I imagine, but satisfying." She set down her cup. "I grew up in the city, so I have little experience with ranching, but I have always thought there was something honest about working with animals and land." Fletcher found himself drawn into conversation despite his reservations. Delilah Vance was intelligent and well-spoken, but without the pretension that had marked Catherine. She told him about her training at a hospital in Philadelphia, how she had faced resistance and condescension from male doctors, but had persevered, because she believed in the importance of quality nursing care. She spoke of her decision to move west after her mother's death, wanting a fresh start somewhere she might be valued for her skills rather than judged by her gender. Dr. Cartwright's letter was the first response I received that did not include some variation of the phrase, "Are you sure a delicate woman such as yourself is suited to this work?" She said with a laugh that held more bitterness than humor. "He simply asked about my qualifications and offered me the position. So here I am, ready to prove myself to Jefferson, Texas." "Jefferson can be a good town," Fletcher said carefully, "but it is small and people talk. You will need to be prepared for that." "I am prepared for many things, Mr. Warren. Gossip is the least of my concerns." She paused, seeming to consider her next words. "May I ask you something? You have been unfailingly polite, but there is a sadness about you, if you do not mind me saying so. Something in your eyes that suggests you have known disappointment." Fletcher stiffened, his defenses immediately rising. "That is a rather personal observation to make of someone you just met." "It is," Delilah agreed without apology, "but I am a nurse and observation is part of my training. I also happen to be naturally curious about people, which is probably a character flaw. You do not have to answer, of course." Fletcher stood, suddenly needing to be away from this perceptive stranger who could see too much with too little information. "I should be going. My freight is waiting and I have work to get back to." Delilah stood as well, concern flickering across her face. "I apologize if I offended you, Mr. Warren. That was not my intention." "No offense taken," Fletcher said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Welcome to Jefferson, Miss Vance. I hope you find what you are looking for here." He left money on the table for both their coffees and walked out of the hotel without looking back, angry at himself for spending time talking with her, for allowing even that small connection to form. Over the following weeks, Fletcher tried to put the encounter out of his mind, but Jefferson was a small town, and avoiding someone completely was nearly impossible. He heard through Marcus that Miss Vance had indeed taken up her position with Dr. Cartwright and was already making a positive impression with patients. Several people mentioned her to him when he came to town, knowing he had been the one to help her that first day, and Fletcher deflected their comments with non-committal grunts. He saw her twice from a distance, once walking down Austin Street with her medical bag, and once at the general store examining supplies. Each time he made sure to go in a different direction before she could notice him. He told himself he was being practical, that he had learned his lesson about women and was simply avoiding potential complications. But late at night in the bunkhouse, he sometimes found himself remembering the intelligence in her amber eyes, the straightforward way she spoke, the absence of artifice that had marked both Margaret and Catherine. It was in early June when fate forced another encounter. Fletcher had been riding fence line in the northeast section of the ranch when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him. He managed to avoid the snake's strike, but he landed badly, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The pain was immediate and intense, and when he tried to move his left arm, it refused to cooperate properly. His horse had bolted back toward the ranch, which meant he was alone, roughly 3 miles from headquarters, with what he suspected was a dislocated shoulder. Fletcher had dislocated his shoulder once before in his early 20s and remembered the excruciating pain. He tried to pop it back in himself, using a fence post for leverage, but the angle was wrong and he only succeeded in making the pain worse. Cursing his bad luck and his horse's skittishness, he began the long walk back to the ranch, cradling his useless arm against his chest. By the time he reached the ranch house, he was sweating profusely and fighting waves of nausea. His brother Marcus took one look at him, and immediately called for someone to ride to town for the doctor. Fletcher wanted to protest that it was not that serious, but the truth was he needed medical attention, and he needed it properly done, doctor. Cartwright arrived 90 minutes later in his buggy, and he was not alone. Delilah Vance climbed down from the passenger seat carrying the medical bag, her expression professional and focused. When she saw Fletcher sitting on the porch steps, her eyes widened slightly in recognition, but she did not comment on their previous meeting. "Mr. Warren," Dr. Cartwright said, breathing heavily as he approached. The old doctor was in his 70s now, with white hair and a pronounced stoop. "Your brother says you have injured your shoulder. Dislocated it, I think," Fletcher said through gritted teeth. "Horse through me." Dr. Cartwright examined him carefully while Delilah stood by, handing the doctor the instruments he needed without being asked. She had clearly learned his methods quickly. After a few minutes of gentle probing that was nonetheless agonizing, Dr. Cartwright nodded. "Definitely dislocated. I will need to reduce it, which is going to hurt considerably. Miss Vance, if you would prepare the laudanum." "Actually," Delilah said quietly, "if I may suggest, doctor, I have had some success with a rapid reduction technique that minimizes the patient's discomfort. It requires speed and confidence, but I believe it would be less traumatic than the traditional method, especially given Mr. Warren's obvious pain level." Dr. Cartwright looked at her with surprise and then interest. "You have done this before." "Several times at the hospital in Philadelphia. There was an orthopedic surgeon there who taught me his method. If you would allow me to try, I believe I can have Mr. Warren's shoulder back in place within moments." Fletcher wanted to protest, wanted to insist on the traditional method with the laudanum, but the pain was clouding his judgment and he found himself nodding. "Just get it done." Delilah moved to kneel beside him, her movements economical and sure. "I am going to need you to trust me, Mr. Warren. This will hurt for about 3 seconds and then the relief will be immediate. Can you do that?" "Yes," Fletcher managed. What happened next was a blur of swift, precise movement. Delilah positioned his arm at a specific angle, placed her hands just so, and then with a speed and force he had not expected from someone of her size, she manipulated the joint. There was a sickening pop, a flash of white-hot agony that made him shout, and then suddenly, miraculously, the pain was gone. Not completely, but reduced to a manageable ache that felt like heaven compared to what he had been experiencing. Fletcher sat there gasping, his good hand clutching the porch railing, while Delilah gently moved his arm through a range of motion to confirm the reduction was complete. "How does that feel?" she asked. "Better," he admitted, still catching his breath. "Much better, doctor." Cartwright was beaming at Delilah with obvious pride. "Remarkable. I have never seen it done quite that smoothly. You will have to teach me that technique, Miss Vance." "Of course, doctor." She turned back to Fletcher. "You will need to keep the arm immobilized for at least a week, preferably 2. I will fit you with a sling, and you must promise not to use it for any heavy work during that time. The joint needs time to heal properly, or you risk injuring it again." Over the next 20 minutes, Delilah created a sling from bandages and showed Marcus how to adjust it properly. She also left instructions for care, what symptoms to watch for, and when Fletcher should come to town for a follow-up examination. Through it all, she was professional and efficient, treating him like any other patient, though Fletcher occasionally caught her glancing at him with what might have been concern or curiosity. When they were preparing to leave, Fletcher found himself saying, "Thank you, Miss Vance." "That was impressive work." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I am glad I could help, Mr. Warren. Please follow the instructions I left. I would hate to see you injure yourself further through stubbornness or impatience." "I will do my best," Fletcher promised, and he meant it. After they left, Marcus sat down beside him on the porch steps. "So that is the woman everyone has been talking about. She certainly knows her business." "That she does," Fletcher agreed. "Pretty too," Marcus added casually. In an unusual sort of way, Fletcher gave his brother a warning look. "Do not start." "Start what?" "I was merely making an observation, though I did notice the way she looked at you when she thought you were not paying attention. You are imagining things." "Maybe," Marcus said with a knowing grin, "but probably not." True to his word, Fletcher kept his arm immobilized and avoided heavy work, much to the frustration of his restless nature. After a week, Marcus insisted on driving him to town for the follow-up examination doctor Cartwright had recommended. Fletcher agreed reluctantly, knowing that his brother was probably right, but also knowing that it meant seeing Delilah again. The doctor's office was located on East Austin Street in a tidy white building that also served as Dr. Cartwright's residence. A small brass sign outside announced visiting hours, and when Fletcher and Marcus entered, they found a modest waiting room with several chairs and a desk where Delilah sat reviewing what appeared to be patient files. She looked up when they entered, and her face brightened. "Mr. Warren, I am pleased to see you following instructions. Please come in. Dr. Cartwright is with another patient at the moment, but I can perform the examination if you are comfortable with that." Fletcher was not entirely comfortable with it, but he nodded anyway. Marcus, the trader, announced that he had errands to run and would return in an hour, leaving Fletcher alone with Delilah in the examination room. The room was clean and well organized, with a padded table, glass cabinets containing medical supplies, and the faint smell of carbolic acid that seemed to permeate all doctors' offices. Delilah washed her hands thoroughly at a basin before turning to him. "Let us see how you have been healing," she said, gesturing for him to remove his sling and shirt. Fletcher complied, suddenly self-conscious about being shirtless in front of her, though he knew it was necessary for the examination. Delilah's examination was thorough and professional, her hands gentle as she tested his range of motion and probed for any signs of lingering damage. "You have been taking good care of it," she observed. "The swelling is almost completely gone, and your mobility is returning nicely. You can start using the arm for light tasks, but nothing heavy for another week at least." "I will try to be patient," Fletcher said. "Somehow I doubt patience is one of your natural virtues," Delilah replied with a slight smile. "You strike me as a man who prefers action to waiting." "You might be right about that." She helped him back into his shirt, then stood back, seeming to consider something. "Mr. Warren, may I speak frankly with you?" Fletcher felt his defenses rising again. "I suppose. When we first met, I made a personal comment that clearly upset you. I have thought about it since, and I wanted to apologize properly. It was presumptuous of me to comment on something I knew nothing about." "You do not need to apologize," Fletcher said stiffly. "Perhaps not, but I want to nonetheless." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I came to Jefferson to start fresh, to leave behind assumptions and judgments that had been made about me in other places. It occurs to me that you might value the same courtesy." Fletcher looked at her, really looked at her, and saw sincerity in those amber eyes. She was offering him something rare, the chance to be seen without the weight of his past failures defining him. The problem was, he was not sure he knew how to accept that offer. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "and I apologize for being short with you that day at the hotel." "You did not deserve that. We all have our tender places," Delilah said gently. "I understand." Over the following months, Fletcher found himself drawn to town more frequently than strictly necessary. He told himself it was because he needed to check on supplies, talk to the banker about ranch business, or help Marcus with various errands. But the truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that he hoped to encounter Delilah Vance. When they did meet, usually by apparent chance on the street or at the general store, their conversations were brief but pleasant. Delilah would tell him about interesting medical cases she had helped doctor. Cartwright with, always being careful not to reveal patient confidences, and Fletcher would share stories about ranch life. He learned that she had a wry sense of humor and a quick laugh, that she read voraciously and had opinions on everything from politics to poetry, that she was lonely in Jefferson despite being good at her work. By late summer, Fletcher realized he was in dangerous territory. He was thinking about Delilah when he should have been focusing on work. He looked forward to their chance meetings with an eagerness that alarmed him. Worst of all, he was beginning to care about her opinion of him, to want her to see him as more than just another cowboy in a town full of them. But every time he considered actually courting her properly, memories of standing at the altar would resurface, vivid and painful. He would remember the pitying looks from the congregation, the humiliation of being left, the certainty that he was fundamentally unworthy of a woman's commitment. How could he risk that again? How could he subject himself to that potential devastation when he had barely survived it the last 2 times? It was Marcus who finally confronted him about it. They were sitting on the porch of Fletcher's small house in town one evening in September, drinking whiskey and watching the sun set over the cypress trees that lined the bayou. "You are an idiot," Marcus announced without preamble. Fletcher looked at his brother. "Care to elaborate?" "Delilah Vance. You are sweet on her, anyone with eyes can see it, but you are too scared to do anything about it." "I am not scared," Fletcher said defensively. "I am being cautious." "Cautious," Marcus repeated with disgust. "Fletcher, you have let what happened with Margaret and Catherine turn you into a coward, and before you get mad and punch me, hear me out." Fletcher was indeed tempted to punch his brother, but he kept his hands on his whiskey glass and waited. "Those women did not deserve you," Marcus continued. "They were selfish and cruel, and what they did to you was unforgivable. But Delilah Vance is not them. She is nothing like them. And if you are too stubborn or too scared to see that, then you are going to let something real slip away." "You do not know what it was like," Fletcher said quietly. "Standing there, waiting, knowing everyone was watching, knowing she was not coming. Twice, Marcus. What does that say about me? It says you had the bad luck to fall for the wrong women. It does not say anything about your worth or whether you deserve happiness." Marcus leaned forward. "But I will tell you what will say something about you. If you let fear keep you from even trying with someone who might actually be right for you, that says you have given up. And the Fletcher I know is not a quitter." The words stayed with Fletcher long after Marcus had gone home. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the truth in his brother's accusations. Was he a coward? Had he let his past define his future so completely that he could not see possibilities when they appeared? The next morning, Fletcher made a decision. He bathed, shaved, put on his best shirt, and rode into town with a specific purpose. He was going to call on Delilah Vance properly as a gentleman and see if she might be interested in his company. If she said no, at least he would know he had tried. He found her at the doctor's office, but when he asked if he might speak with her privately, Dr. Cartwright cheerfully announced that Delilah was due for a lunch break and shooed them both out the door. They walked to the small park near the courthouse, where oak trees provided shade and a few wrought iron benches offered places to sit. Delilah settled on one of the benches and looked at Fletcher with open curiosity. "This seems rather formal, Mr. Warren. Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Fletcher said, standing in front of her and turning his hat in his hands. "I wanted to ask you something, and I wanted to do it properly." "All right," Delilah said slowly. Fletcher took a breath. "Would you allow me to call on you, properly, I mean?" With the intention of courtship. Delilah's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she said nothing. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "I would like that very much, Mr. Warren." The relief that flooded through Fletcher was so intense he almost laughed. "You would?" "I would." "I have been hoping you might ask, actually, though I was beginning to think you never would." "I am a slow study sometimes," Fletcher admitted, "but I figure it is better to be late than never." "I agree completely." Delilah stood and took a step closer to him. "Though I should probably tell you something first, so you know what you are getting into." Fletcher's stomach clenched. Here it came, the revelation that would explain why she was willing to court him. Some terrible secret, some deal breaker that would make this all make sense. "I am stubborn, opinionated, and I tend to speak my mind even when silence might be wiser," Delilah said. "I have no patience for dishonesty or games, and I expect to be treated as an equal partner, not as a delicate flower that needs constant protection. If those things are going to be a problem for you, it is better we know now." Fletcher felt the smile tugging at his lips. "I think I can manage all of that. Though I should warn you in return that I am set in my ways, terrible at expressing my feelings, and I have a habit of working too much and talking too little." "I think I can manage all of that as well," Delilah replied, her eyes sparkling with amusement and something warmer. Their courtship began properly after that, with Sunday afternoon walks and occasional dinners at the hotel restaurant. Fletcher was careful not to rush things, mindful of his own fears, and determined not to let them sabotage what was developing between them. Delilah was patient with his cautiousness, but she also pushed him gently to open up, to share his thoughts and feelings rather than keeping everything locked inside. It was after about a month of courtship that Delilah finally asked about his past. They were sitting by the bayou one evening, watching the water flow slowly past, when she said, "Will you tell me about the women who hurt you? I know it is painful, but I think it stands between us sometimes, and I would like to understand." Fletcher's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject or make light of it. But he had promised himself he would not play games with Delilah, would not hide behind walls the way he had for the past 2 years. So he told her. About Margaret and her sudden departure, about Catherine and her betrayal, about standing at the altar twice, about the humiliation and the pain, and the certainty that he was somehow cursed or flawed in a way that made women unable to commit to him. Delilah listened without interruption, her hand finding his and holding it firmly. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Those women were fools," she said finally. "And I do not say that lightly. I am sure they had their reasons, their fears, their own complications. But to hurt someone the way they hurt you, to make promises they did not intend to keep, that is the action of fools and cowards. You deserved better than that." "Sometimes I wonder if I saw only what I wanted to see," Fletcher admitted. "If I missed signs that they were not really committed." "Perhaps," Delilah said. "But that is the risk we all take when we love someone. We trust that they are being honest with us, that their commitment matches our own. When they betray that trust, it says something about their character, not ours." "I am afraid," Fletcher said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I am afraid to believe this is real, to trust that you will not disappear like they did." Delilah turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I cannot promise that we will work out perfectly, that there will not be difficulties or disagreements. But I can promise you this: I will not run. I will not make promises I do not intend to keep. If something is wrong, I will tell you. If I have doubts, I will share them. I will not leave you standing alone wondering what happened." Fletcher pulled her close then, holding her against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his. "That is all I can ask," he whispered. As autumn turned to winter, their relationship deepened. Fletcher found himself opening up in ways he had not thought possible, sharing dreams and fears he had never spoken aloud. Delilah met his family, charming Marcus and his wife Sarah, playing with their young children, fitting into the Warren family dynamic as if she had always belonged there. She also met the Whitmores and the men at the ranch, and Fletcher felt a fierce pride in how capably she handled all of it, how she could converse with rough cowboys and wealthy ranchers with equal ease. She was not trying to change herself to fit into his world. She was simply being herself, and somehow that was enough. It was in December, on a cold evening when the first real frost had settled over Jefferson, that Fletcher realized he wanted to marry Delilah. The thought did not come with panic or fear this time, but with a quiet certainty that felt entirely different from what he had experienced with Margaret or Catherine. This was not infatuation or wishful thinking. This was a deep, abiding love built on respect and understanding and genuine connection. But the specter of those failed weddings still haunted him. How could he ask Delilah to marry him when he had been left twice before? What if his fear of it happening again somehow made it happen? What if he was cursed, and by proposing to her, he was setting them both up for heartbreak? He discussed it with Marcus, who listened patiently before saying, "You are overthinking this. If you love her and she loves you, the rest is just details." "Those details nearly destroyed me," Fletcher pointed out. "Those details involved women who did not really love you. Delilah is different. But if you are this worried, talk to her about it. Tell her your fears. She is a smart woman, she will understand." So Fletcher did. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, he took Delilah to his small house and built a fire in the fireplace. They sat together on the worn sofa he had inherited from his parents, and he told her what he was thinking. "I want to marry you," he said, watching her face carefully. "But I am terrified to ask." Delilah did not look surprised, because of what happened before. "Yes, I know it is irrational, but I cannot shake the feeling that I am cursed somehow, that if I propose, something will go wrong again." "Fletcher," Delilah said gently, taking both his hands in hers. "Do you love me more than I thought possible to love anyone? And do you believe I love you?" "Yes," he said, and he realized he did believe it completely. "Then we are already different from what you had before. Love is not a curse, it is a gift, and I am not Margaret or Catherine. I am Delilah, and I am choosing you, not out of obligation or expectation or temporary infatuation, but because you are the man I want to spend my life with." Fletcher felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of fear and pain that had been there so long he had forgotten it was not a natural part of him. "You are absolutely certain as I have ever been about anything," she smiled. "Though I should mention that I would prefer if you actually ask me properly, rather than just talking about wanting to marry me." Fletcher laughed, the sound surprising him with its lightness. He slid off the sofa and knelt in front of her, still holding her hands. "Delilah Vance, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, absolutely yes." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and relief and hope into it, and she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Delilah said, "Though I have one condition." Fletcher felt a flutter of old anxiety. "What is that?" "No elaborate church wedding. No crowds of people waiting to see if I will show up. I want something simple, just us and the people we truly care about. I do not want you standing at an altar wondering if I am going to appear. I want to stand beside you from the beginning." The relief was so profound Fletcher almost laughed. That sounds perfect. They were married on a clear, cold Saturday in January of 1883, in the parlor of Fletcher's house with only Marcus and Sarah, Dr. Cartwright, and a handful of close friends in attendance. Delilah wore a simple dress of ivory wool, and Fletcher wore his best suit. There was no aisle to walk down, no waiting at an altar, no chance for doubt or fear to creep in. They stood together in front of Reverend Thompson, speaking their vows with steady voices and certain hearts. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed his bride and felt the last of his old wounds finally heal. This was real. This was his second chance, or maybe his third, but more importantly, it was his new beginning. The reception was held at Marcus and Sarah's house, a cheerful affair with too much food and plenty of whiskey and laughter that echoed through the rooms. Fletcher watched Delilah move through the small crowd, talking and laughing, her hand frequently finding his as if to reassure both of them that this was real, that they were truly married. Late in the evening, Marcus pulled Fletcher aside. "You look happy," he observed. "I am," Fletcher said, and meant it completely. "She is good for you. I knew she would be." "You were right," Fletcher admitted. "Though do not let it go to your head." Marcus grinned. Too late. Fletcher and Delilah settled into married life with surprising ease. She moved into his house, bringing her books and medical texts, and the few personal belongings she had accumulated in her travels. She continued working with Dr. Cartwright, a decision Fletcher supported fully despite some raised eyebrows from the more traditional members of Jefferson society. He liked that his wife was capable and independent, that she had her own purpose beyond simply being Mrs. Warren. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. They had disagreements about money, about how much time Fletcher spent at the ranch, about Delilah's tendency to work too many hours without rest. But they talked through each conflict, learning each other's patterns and preferences, building a foundation of trust and communication that felt solid in a way Fletcher's previous relationships never had. In the spring of 1884, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. Fletcher's joy was tempered by worry. He fretted over her health, wanting her to stop working immediately, while Delilah insisted she was perfectly capable of continuing her duties for several more months. They compromised, with Delilah gradually reducing her hours as the pregnancy progressed. Their son was born in October of 1884, a healthy baby they named Benjamin Marcus Warren, after Dr. Cartwright and Fletcher's brother. Fletcher held his son for the first time and felt a surge of love so intense it brought tears to his eyes. This was his family, his real family, and the happiness he felt was so far removed from the despair of those days standing at the altar that it seemed like a different lifetime entirely. Dr. Cartwright retired the following year, his health finally failing to the point where he could no longer practice. He left his practice and all his medical equipment to Delilah, telling her that she was the future of medicine in Jefferson. With Fletcher's full support and financial backing, Delilah converted the office into a proper clinic, hiring a young doctor fresh from medical school in Houston to work alongside her. The Vance Warren Clinic, as it became known, quickly gained a reputation for quality care and progressive practices. Delilah trained other women as nurses, believing firmly in the importance of skilled nursing care. Fletcher watched his wife thrive in her work, and he was proud of what she had built. Their daughter, Clara Ann Warren, was born in the summer of 1886, a dark-haired, amber-eyed beauty who resembled her mother in both looks and temperament. Fletcher discovered he had a gift for fatherhood, surprising himself with his patience and delight in his children. Benjamin, who they called Ben, was a serious, thoughtful child, while Clara was adventurous and bold. Life at the Double W Ranch continued to prosper under Fletcher's management, and in 1887, the Whitmores made him a partner in the operation, acknowledging his years of dedicated service and sound business decisions. The additional income allowed Fletcher to expand his own holdings, purchasing land adjacent to the ranch and starting a small herd of his own. By 1888, Fletcher Warren was a successful rancher, a devoted husband, and a proud father. The man who had stood at the altar twice, broken and humiliated, seemed like a distant memory, a chapter from someone else's life. When people in Jefferson spoke of him now, it was with respect and admiration, not pity. One evening in late spring, Fletcher and Delilah sat on the porch of their house, which they had expanded to accommodate their growing family. The children were asleep inside, and the evening was warm and pleasant, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of owls in the cypress trees. "Do you ever think about those other women?" Delilah asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "Margaret and Catherine," Fletcher considered the question. "Rarely," he said honestly, "and when I do, it is without pain. I used to think they broke something in me that could not be fixed, but I was wrong. They just broke my faith in my own judgment. You helped me rebuild that." "You did most of the rebuilding yourself," Delilah said. "I just stood beside you while you did it. You did more than that." Fletcher took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You showed up when I needed someone to believe in, and you kept showing up every day after. You proved that love does not have to be complicated or painful or uncertain. Sometimes it can just be steady and real and good." Delilah leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am glad I took that position in Jefferson. I am glad your horse threw you that day, even though I know it hurt terribly. I am glad for every random chance that brought us together." "I am too," Fletcher said. "Though I am not glad about the shoulder injury itself." She laughed softly. "Fair enough." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Fletcher thought about the path that had brought him to this moment. All the pain and disappointment that had seemed unbearable at the time but had ultimately led him here. To this porch, with this woman, with the life they had built together. In 1889, their third child arrived, a boy they named Thomas Fletcher Warren. This pregnancy had been harder on Delilah, and Fletcher had worried throughout, but both mother and child came through healthy and strong. Thomas was a cheerful baby, quick to smile, and he completed their family in a way that felt perfect. As the children grew, Fletcher found himself telling them stories about his own childhood, about growing up in Texas when it was still wild and unpredictable, about learning to work with horses and cattle from his father. He told them about their Uncle Marcus and the trouble they had gotten into as boys. But he never told them about Margaret or Catherine, about standing at the altar in humiliation and pain. Some stories were not meant for children, and some wounds, though healed, did not need to be reopened. Delilah understood his silence on the subject. She had her own painful memories from her past, times when she had been dismissed or belittled simply for being a woman in a profession dominated by men. They both carried scars, but they had learned to carry them together, to support each other through the moments when old hurts resurfaced unexpectedly. The clinic continued to thrive, becoming an essential institution in Jefferson. Delilah trained dozens of nurses over the years, many of whom went on to work in hospitals and clinics throughout East Texas. She also advocated tirelessly for better public health measures, improved sanitation in the poorer sections of town, and education about disease prevention. Fletcher supported her work in every way he could, both financially and emotionally, proud of the difference she was making. In 1892, when Fletcher turned 43, he found himself reflecting on the decade that had passed since he married Delilah. 10 years that had transformed him from a bitter, broken man into someone content and whole. 10 years that had given him 3 beautiful children and a partnership that grew stronger with each passing season. 10 years that had proven, beyond any doubt, that his past failures had not been a curse, but simply the clearing away of what was not meant to be, making room for what was. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher planned a surprise for Delilah. He arranged for Marcus and Sarah to watch the children for an entire weekend, something that had never happened in their decade of marriage. He booked the best room at the Grand Hotel, the same hotel where he had first helped Delilah with her damaged trunks all those years ago. He bought her flowers and a new dress and planned a dinner at the hotel restaurant. When he revealed the surprise, Delilah's delight was worth every moment of secretive planning. They spent the weekend like they were courting again, taking long walks, having uninterrupted conversations, reconnecting in ways that were difficult with 3 young children constantly demanding attention. On their last evening at the hotel, lying in bed with Delilah curled against his side, Fletcher said, "Thank you for showing up." Delilah lifted her head to look at him, puzzled. "What do you mean, that day at the hotel when I helped you with your trunks?" "You showed up in Jefferson in my life at exactly the moment I needed someone like you. And then you kept showing up, kept choosing me, kept believing in us even when I was too scared to believe in myself. You made me believe again in love, in marriage, in the possibility of happiness. So thank you for showing up." Delilah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You make it sound like I did something extraordinary, but I just loved you. That was the easiest thing I have ever done." "It felt extraordinary to me," Fletcher insisted. "After everything that happened before, after I had convinced myself I was not meant for this kind of happiness, you proved me wrong. You showed up at that altar with me, and you have been standing beside me ever since." "And I always will be," Delilah promised, kissing him softly. "For as long as we both shall live, remember." "I remember," Fletcher said. "I will never forget." The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Ben grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's intelligence. He showed early aptitude for medicine and expressed interest in following his mother's path, though Fletcher also taught him everything he could about ranching, wanting his son to understand the work that had sustained their family. Clara was bold and fearless, a girl who climbed trees and rode horses and asked endless questions about everything. She reminded Fletcher of Delilah's independent spirit, and he made sure she knew that her curiosity and strength were things to be celebrated, not suppressed. Thomas was the peacemaker, the child who could smooth over any conflict between his siblings, who had a gift for seeing all sides of a situation. In 1895, Marcus's wife, Sarah, died suddenly of pneumonia, leaving Marcus devastated and alone with their 4 children. Fletcher and Delilah immediately opened their home to the family, helping with child care and meals and emotional support. It was Delilah who sat with Marcus during the worst of his grief, who understood the particular pain of losing a partner, even though her loss had been different from his. Fletcher watched his wife comfort his brother and felt a renewed appreciation for her compassion and strength. The W Ranch continued to prosper, expanding its operations to include horse breeding in addition to cattle. Fletcher took on more of a management role as he aged, hiring capable foremen to handle the day-to-day operations while he focused on business strategy and planning. He found he enjoyed this aspect of the work, using his decades of experience to make decisions that benefited not just the ranch, but the entire community of workers who depended on it. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, Fletcher worried that Ben, now 13 and idealistic, might be swept up in war fever when he came of age. But the war was brief, and by the time it ended, Ben's interests had solidified firmly in the direction of medicine rather than military service. Fletcher was secretly relieved, having seen enough violence in his younger years to not wish it on his children. As the 19th century drew to a close, Fletcher found himself looking back on his life with satisfaction and looking forward with hope. He had built something lasting with Delilah, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. His children were healthy and happy, growing into good people with solid values. His work was fulfilling, his community respected him, and his family loved him. On a warm evening in the summer of 1899, the entire extended Warren family gathered at Fletcher and Delilah's house for a celebration. Marcus had remarried the previous year to a kind widow named Elizabeth, and the combined families now included 10 children of various ages. The house and yard were filled with laughter and noise and the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering. Fletcher stood at the edge of the porch, watching his children play with their cousins, watching Delilah move through the crowd with easy grace, still beautiful at 40, still the woman who had changed his life simply by showing up and staying. Marcus joined him, handing him a glass of whiskey. "Not bad for a man who was convinced he was cursed," Marcus said with a grin. Fletcher laughed. "I was never cursed. I was just waiting for the right person. Took you long enough to figure that out." "Better late than never," Fletcher replied, echoing words he had spoken to Delilah all those years ago when he finally worked up the courage to ask to court her. "I am grateful you convinced me to take a chance," Fletcher continued. "That day you called me a coward. It stung because it was true. I was letting fear control my life. If you had not pushed me, I might never have asked Delilah to let me court her, and I would have missed all of this." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "That is what brothers are for, to tell you the hard truths when you need to hear them." They stood in companionable silence, watching the party continue around them. Delilah caught Fletcher's eye from across the yard and smiled, a smile that was just for him, full of shared history and ongoing love. He smiled back, raising his glass in a small toast that only she would understand. In 1900, as a new century dawned, Ben enrolled in medical school in Galveston, following his mother's path into medicine. Fletcher and Delilah traveled with him to the coast, helping him settle into his dormitory and meeting his professors. On the trip home, Delilah was quiet, and Fletcher knew she was processing the reality of their oldest child leaving home. "He will be fine," Fletcher said, taking her hand as the train rattled through the East Texas countryside. "You taught him well. He has all your skill and compassion." "I know," Delilah said, "but it is strange to think of him out there on his own, making his way in the world." "He is not truly on his own," Fletcher reminded her. "He carries everything we taught him, everything we gave him, just like we carried what our parents taught us." "When did you become so wise?" Delilah asked with a watery smile. "I learned from the best," Fletcher replied, kissing her temple. Clara, at 14, announced that she had no interest in marriage and wanted instead to study law, an ambition that would have scandalized many families, but which Fletcher and Delilah supported wholeheartedly. Thomas, at 11, was still figuring out his path, but he showed talent with animals and an interest in veterinary medicine. The clinic had become such an established institution in Jefferson that when Delilah talked about eventually retiring, the town council approached her about making it a municipal facility, supported by town funds. After much discussion, Delilah agreed, with the understanding that she would continue to have input on its operations and training programs. The Vance Warren Clinic became the Jefferson Medical Center in 1902, with a bronze plaque crediting Delilah's vision and dedication. Fletcher, now 53, gradually transitioned full ownership of his portion of the ranch operation to a partnership with Ben, who had expressed interest in combining medicine and ranching, perhaps serving as a doctor for rural communities. Fletcher liked the idea of keeping the land in the family while also serving a broader purpose. In 1903, tragedy struck when the Great Galveston hurricane of the previous decade was followed by severe flooding in East Texas. Jefferson, dependent on the bayou for its commercial access, suffered significant damage. Fletcher organized relief efforts, using ranch resources to help families who had lost homes and livestock. Delilah worked around the clock at the clinic, treating injured residents and coordinating with other medical professionals from surrounding towns. It was during this crisis that Fletcher truly saw the depths of what he and Delilah had built together. Their children, now young adults and nearly so, worked alongside them without complaint. Ben came home from medical school to help at the clinic. Clara organized food and supply distribution. Thomas helped rescue animals and rebuild damaged structures. The Warren family had become a force for good in their community, and Fletcher knew that foundation came from the love and partnership he shared with Delilah. After the crisis passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy, Fletcher and Delilah took a rare evening for themselves, walking along the bayou where they had courted all those years ago. The path was familiar, worn smooth by countless walks, but it never grew old. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked. "Marrying me, I mean, taking on a man with so much baggage and fear." Delilah stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "Not once, not for a single moment. Yes, you came with complications, but so did I. We all carry our histories with us. The question is not whether we have baggage, but whether we are willing to help each other carry it." "You made that easy," Fletcher said. "You made everything easy, even the hard parts." "That is love, I think," Delilah mused. "Not making life perfect or problem-free, but making the imperfect life feel worthwhile." Fletcher pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady presence that had anchored him for over 20 years. "I love you," he said simply. "I do not say it often enough, but I love you more now than the day we married." "I know," Delilah said, her arms wrapping around him. "I have always known, and I love you just as much." In 1905, Ben graduated from medical school and returned to Jefferson to work alongside his mother at the medical center. The town celebrated with genuine joy, proud of their native son who had gone away to learn and chosen to return. Fletcher watched his son take his first steps as a practicing physician and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was legacy, this passing of knowledge and values from one generation to the next. Clara, true to her word, left for law school in Austin that same year, determined to break barriers and make her mark in a male-dominated profession. Fletcher worried about the challenges she would face, but he also knew she had the strength and intelligence to overcome them. She was her mother's daughter in every way that mattered. Thomas, at 16, had indeed discovered a passion for veterinary medicine, and was already apprenticing with the only veterinarian in Jefferson, learning the trade while finishing his schooling. Fletcher took him on ranch rounds regularly, teaching him about animal husbandry and the practical applications of veterinary care in a ranching context. As Fletcher approached his mid-50s, he found himself thinking more about the past, not with regret, but with a kind of wonder at how things had worked out. Those 2 failed weddings, which had seemed like the end of his world at the time, had actually been necessary clearing away of what was not meant to be. If Margaret had not run off with that salesman, if Catherine had not left him for the lawyer from Marshall, he never would have been available when Delilah arrived in Jefferson. He mentioned this one evening to Delilah, trying to articulate the strange gratitude he felt for painful experiences that had ultimately led him to happiness. "I used to think I was cursed," he said, "but maybe I was actually protected. Protected from marriages that would have been wrong, saved for the one that was right." "That is a generous way to view it," Delilah said, "though I think it gives too much credit to fate and not enough to your own resilience. You survived those disappointments, learned from them, and grew into someone capable of the relationship we have. That was not fate. That was you doing the hard work of healing and growing." "Maybe it was both," Fletcher suggested. "My work and fate's timing." "Maybe," Delilah agreed with a smile. In 1907, Clara returned from her first year of law school with stories of discrimination and small victories, of professors who dismissed her and classmates who supported her. She was fiercer than ever, more determined, and Fletcher could not have been prouder. She reminded him that the world was changing, that women like Delilah and Clara were forcing those changes through sheer determination and excellence. That same year, Ben married a young woman named Rose Thompson, the daughter of Reverend Thompson who had married Fletcher and Delilah all those years ago. The wedding was held in the same church where Fletcher had stood twice before, waiting for brides who never came. But this time, Fletcher watched from the pews as his son stood confidently at the altar, and when Rose appeared in the doorway in her white dress, Fletcher felt the ghost of his old pain finally release its last hold on him. The woman showed up. Rose walked down that aisle with joy and confidence, taking her place beside Ben with a smile that lit up the entire church. And Fletcher realized that this was what he had been waiting to see all along. Proof that not every bride disappears, that not every wedding ends in heartbreak, that love can be trusted after all. Delilah squeezed his hand during the ceremony, understanding without words what this moment meant to him. When he looked at her, he saw tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears, tears of joy for their son and relief for her husband's final healing. The reception was held at the Warren house, which had been expanded again over the years to accommodate their growing family and frequent gatherings. Fletcher gave a toast to the new couple, his voice steady and sure. "To Ben and Rose," he said, raising his glass. "May your marriage be filled with love, respect, and the kind of partnership that makes every challenge bearable and every joy sweeter. May you show up for each other every single day, in big ways and small, and may you never take for granted the gift of finding someone who truly sees you and loves you anyway." The guests cheered and drank, but Fletcher saw Delilah watching him with an expression of such love and understanding that he had to look away before he embarrassed himself with tears. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Fletcher and Delilah lay in bed, neither quite ready for sleep. "That was a beautiful toast," Delilah said softly, "and I know it meant more than most people realized." "I wanted Ben to understand," Fletcher said. "To appreciate what he has with Rose, to never take it for granted the way I did in my early attempts at marriage." "You did not take it for granted," Delilah corrected gently. "You just chose the wrong partners. There is a difference." "Maybe. But I also did not fight for those relationships the way I should have. I let doubts and fears undermine them before they even had a chance to fail or succeed on their own merits." "And with me?" Delilah asked. "With you I fought," Fletcher said. "I fought my fear, fought my past, fought the voice in my head that said I was not worthy of happiness. And that made all the difference." "We both fought," Delilah said. That is what made it work. They fell asleep holding each other as they had for 25 years, as they would for all the years to come. The years from 1907 to 1910 passed in the comfortable rhythm of a well-lived life. Ben and Rose had their first child in 1908, a daughter named Delilah Rose Warren, and Fletcher discovered the particular joy of being a grandfather. Holding his granddaughter, seeing his son navigate fatherhood with the same mixture of terror and wonder Fletcher had experienced, created a sense of continuity that was deeply satisfying. Clara graduated from law school in 1909 and immediately opened a practice in Austin specializing in property rights and women's legal issues. She faced significant resistance from the established legal community, but she persevered, building a reputation for excellence and integrity that gradually overcame prejudice. Fletcher and Delilah visited her regularly, marveling at her success and her refusal to compromise her principles. Thomas completed his veterinary training and opened a practice in Jefferson in 1910, filling a genuine need in the community. He had inherited his mother's compassion and his father's steady competence, and Fletcher knew the family legacy was secure in the hands of his children. On their 28th wedding anniversary in January of 1911, Fletcher took Delilah back to the parlor where they had been married. Marcus and Elizabeth still lived in the same house, and they were happy to accommodate the request for privacy in that particular room. Standing in the space where they had spoken their vows nearly 3 decades earlier, Fletcher took both of Delilah's hands in his. "I want to renew our vows," he said. "Not because there is anything wrong, but because I want to say them again with everything I know now, with all the experience we have gained." Delilah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I would like that." They spoke their vows to each other, the same words they had said in 1883, but with deeper meaning, with the weight of years and experiences and challenges overcome. When Fletcher said, "for better or worse," he thought of the floods and droughts, the financial worries and family crises they had weathered together. When he said "in sickness and in health," he remembered Delilah nursing him through a bad bout of pneumonia in 1897, her steady presence keeping him anchored when fever made him delirious. When Delilah said "to love and to cherish," Fletcher heard all the small daily acts of love that had built their life together, all the morning coffees and evening conversations and quiet moments of simply being together. They kissed as husband and wife for what felt like both the first time and the 1,000th time, and Fletcher felt complete in a way he had never imagined possible back when he was standing at an altar, waiting for women who would never show up. In 1913, the nation was changing rapidly, with automobiles becoming more common and electricity arriving even in small towns like Jefferson. The modern world was arriving, bringing with it both progress and challenges. Fletcher, now 64, sometimes felt out of step with the rapid pace of change, but Delilah, ever forward-thinking, embraced the possibilities. Their children were all successful in their chosen fields, creating their own families and legacies. The Warren name had become synonymous with integrity and community service in East Texas, a reputation Fletcher treasured far more than any monetary success. On a spring evening in 1914, Fletcher and Delilah sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the sun set over the land Fletcher had worked for more than 40 years. "You remember the day we met?" Delilah asked. "When you helped me with my trunks?" "I remember," Fletcher said. "I remember thinking you were trouble, that getting involved with you would only lead to complications." "And you were right," Delilah said with a laugh. "I have been complicating your life ever since." "The best kind of complications," Fletcher said. The kind that make life worth living. I was so angry that day, Delilah reminisced. Tired from traveling, frustrated with that conductor, worried about starting over in a new place. And then this man stepped in to help me, this serious, sad-eyed cowboy who looked like he had seen his share of troubles. I had, Fletcher acknowledged, but I had not yet seen the other side of those troubles. I had not yet learned that pain can be temporary and happiness can last. I saw something in you that day, Delilah continued. Underneath the sadness, there was goodness and strength. I wanted to know more about what had caused the sadness, but also about the strength that let you carry it. And you stuck around long enough to find out, Fletcher said. I did. And I have never regretted it. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder in a gesture as familiar as breathing. You know what I think? I think those other women did you a favor, even though they hurt you terribly. They cleared the path for us to find each other. I was just thinking something similar the other day, Fletcher admitted, though it took me long enough to see it that way. Some lessons take time to learn, Delilah said philosophically. The important thing is that we learn them eventually. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. Fletcher thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from the devastation of those failed weddings to the deep contentment of his life with Delilah. It had not been a straight path, and there had been times when he was certain he would never recover from the damage Margaret and Catherine had done. But he had recovered, and more than that, he had thrived. He had built a life that mattered, raised children who contributed to their communities, partnered with a woman who challenged and supported him in equal measure. The fear that he was somehow cursed or unworthy of love had been proven spectacularly wrong, not just in the moment Delilah agreed to marry him, but in every day of their marriage since. I love you, Fletcher said, the words coming easily now after years of practice. Thank you for showing up. Always, Delilah replied, the single word encompassing everything. Their past, their present, their future. The promise she had made 31 years ago when she agreed to court him, strengthened and renewed with each passing day. As 1915 arrived, bringing with it increasing tensions in Europe that would soon draw America into the Great War, Fletcher and Delilah stood together, facing whatever came next with the confidence of a partnership forged through time and tested by challenges. They had created something lasting, something that would outlive them in the form of their children and grandchildren, in the institutions they had built, in the example of their love. Ben and Rose had welcomed their third child. Clara had married a fellow lawyer and was expecting her first baby. Thomas had found love with a rancher's daughter and was planning a summer wedding. The Warren family was growing, expanding, carrying forward the values Fletcher and Delilah had worked so hard to instill. On Fletcher's 66th birthday in the spring of 1915, the entire extended family gathered for a celebration. As Fletcher looked around at the crowd of children, grandchildren, siblings, nieces, and nephews, he was struck by how full his life had become. This abundance had seemed impossible back in 1881, when he stood at an altar for the second time, watching the door for a bride who would never arrive. But she had arrived, just not when or how he expected. Delilah had shown up in his life disguised as a stranger with damaged luggage, a woman who needed help, a nurse with no connection to his painful past. She had shown up and kept showing up, day after day, year after year, proving through her steadfast presence that love was not about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about choosing each other consistently over time. Late that night, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Fletcher found Delilah on the porch, looking up at the stars. "Too much excitement for one day?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Just needed a moment of quiet, she said, though it was a wonderful party. You are well loved, Fletcher Warren. I am fortunate, Fletcher corrected. Fortunate in my family, fortunate in my work, and most fortunate in you. We are fortunate in each other, Delilah said. That is how the best marriages work. Fletcher reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. After more than 3 decades together, these small touches had become unconscious, a physical manifestation of their connection that required no thought, only presence. Do you remember what you said to me that day in my examination room? Fletcher asked. When I was there for my shoulder follow-up. I said many things that day, Delilah replied with a smile. You said you came to Jefferson to start fresh, to leave behind assumptions and judgments that had been made about you in other places, and you suggested I might value the same courtesy. I remember, Delilah said softly. You gave me that courtesy, Fletcher continued. You did not judge me for my failures, did not see me as damaged or cursed. You just saw me as a man with a past, same as everyone else. That was the first step toward believing I deserved another chance. You always deserved another chance, Delilah said firmly. You just needed to believe it yourself. You helped me believe, Fletcher insisted. Every time you showed up, every time you chose me, you proved that I was not the failure I thought I was. You made me believe in love again, in marriage again, in myself again. Delilah turned to face him fully, her expression tender in the starlight. And you made me believe that there were good men in the world, men who could see a woman as a partner rather than a possession, who could support rather than limit. We saved each other, Fletcher. That is what people who truly love each other do. They sat together under the vast Texas sky, 2 people who had found each other against improbable odds, who had built something beautiful from the rubble of past disappointments. Around them, the night was alive with sound. Crickets singing, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. It was the soundtrack of their life together, familiar and comforting. As 1915 progressed, the world beyond Jefferson grew increasingly troubled. War raged in Europe, and there was growing sentiment that America would eventually be drawn into the conflict. Fletcher worried about the younger men in the community, including his nephews, who might face conscription if the nation joined the war. But in Jefferson itself, life continued its steady rhythm of seasons and celebrations, births and deaths, the small dramas that made up the fabric of community life. Fletcher and Delilah had become pillars of Jefferson society, respected elders whose marriage was held up as an example of enduring love. Young couples sometimes sought their advice, and Fletcher found himself in the odd position of being considered wise about relationships after spending so many years convinced he knew nothing about them. When asked what made a marriage work, Fletcher's answer was always the same: show up. Every day, in every way you can, show up for each other. That is the secret if there is one. Delilah's answer was similar but with her characteristic directness. Choose each other, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. Love is not just a feeling. It is a series of choices you make over and over again. Together, their advice encompassed the full truth of what had made their marriage work. The showing up and the choosing, the consistency and the deliberation, the feeling and the action. They had built their life on these principles, and the results spoke for themselves. In December of 1916, as Fletcher approached his 68th birthday and America's entry into the war seemed increasingly inevitable, Fletcher experienced a health scare that reminded both him and Delilah of their mortality. He suffered what the doctor believed was a minor heart episode, nothing immediately life-threatening but a warning to slow down and be mindful of his health. The incident frightened Fletcher less than it did Delilah, who immediately began regulating his diet and activities with the same determination she had brought to every other challenge in their lives. Fletcher accepted her ministrations with good grace, understanding that her worry came from love, and that fighting her on this would only cause unnecessary conflict. As he recovered over the following weeks, Fletcher found himself reflecting on his life with a new urgency. He wanted to make sure Delilah knew how much she meant to him, how completely she had transformed his existence. One evening, he sat down at the small desk in their bedroom and wrote her a letter, something he had never done before in all their years together. The letter detailed everything he had never quite found the words to say aloud. How lost he had been after those failed weddings, how certain he was that he was unworthy of love, how close he had come to giving up entirely on the possibility of marriage. He wrote about seeing her that first day at the hotel, how he had been drawn to help her despite his determination to avoid entanglements. He wrote about their courtship, about the fear that had nearly kept him from proposing, about the moment at their wedding when he realized his luck had finally changed. He wrote about their decades together, about the joy of watching her work at the clinic, about the pride he felt in her accomplishments, about the contentment of their daily life together. He wrote about their children and grandchildren, about the family they had created, about the legacy they were leaving. And he wrote about his gratitude, profound and endless, for her patience, her strength, her love, her decision to show up and keep showing up for more than 3 decades. When he finished, he sealed the letter in an envelope and hid it in the drawer of his nightstand, with instructions to Marcus to give it to Delilah if anything should happen to him. He did not expect to die soon, but the heart episode had reminded him that life was uncertain, and he wanted to make sure she knew everything. Fletcher recovered fully from the health scare, and life returned to normal. America did enter the war in the spring of 1917, and several young men from Jefferson enlisted or were conscripted. Fletcher helped organize support efforts for the troops, while Delilah trained additional nurses to prepare for potential casualties when the soldiers returned home. Thomas's wedding proceeded as planned in June of 1917, a joyful celebration despite the shadow of war hanging over the nation. Fletcher walked beside Delilah down the aisle as honored guests, and he could not help but think of his own wedding, small and intimate and perfect. Thomas and his bride, Catherine Ann Buchanan, exchanged vows with obvious love and commitment, and Fletcher said a silent prayer of thanks that his children had all found partners worthy of them. The war years were difficult for everyone, marked by anxiety for the young men fighting overseas and the economic strain of supporting the war effort. But they also brought the community together in ways that reminded Fletcher of why he loved Jefferson. People helped each other, shared resources, supported families whose sons and husbands were serving abroad. Delilah worked tirelessly at the medical center, treating returning veterans and training others to do the same. When the war finally ended in November of 1918, Jefferson celebrated with restrained joy, knowing that not all their young men would return. The community came together to mourn their losses and welcome home their heroes, and Fletcher and Delilah were at the center of those efforts, using their influence and resources to help families transition back to peacetime. In the aftermath of the war, Fletcher found himself ready to retire from active ranch management. At 69, he had spent more than 40 years working with cattle and horses, and his body was telling him it was time to slow down. He turned over full control of his portion of the operation to Ben, who had proven himself more than capable of managing both his medical practice and the ranching interests. Retirement suited Fletcher. He spent his days raiding, working in the garden Delilah had maintained for years, and playing with his growing number of grandchildren. He and Delilah took walks along the bayou, their pace slower than it had been decades earlier, but their companionship as strong as ever. On a warm evening in the spring of 1920, as they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary, Fletcher presented Delilah with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal, expensive and beautifully made, with her initials embossed on the cover. "What is this for?" Delilah asked, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "I want you to write down your story," Fletcher said. "Your experiences as a nurse, your struggles as a woman in medicine, your accomplishments at the clinic. It is important history and it should be preserved." Delilah looked at him with surprise and something deeper, something that might have been tears. "That is incredibly thoughtful. You made history," Fletcher said simply. "The least we can do is record it properly." Over the following months, Delilah did write her story, filling page after page with her experiences and observations. Fletcher would often find her at the kitchen table in the evenings, writing by lamplight, her face focused and intent. Sometimes she would share passages with him, and he would marvel at her ability to capture both the clinical details of her work and the emotional reality of fighting for recognition and respect in a male-dominated field. In 1921, Clara published a groundbreaking legal treatise on women's property rights that gained national attention. Fletcher and Delilah traveled to Austin for the book launch, proud beyond words of their daughter's accomplishments. Watching Clara speak to a packed audience about legal reform and women's equality, Fletcher was reminded of all the ways his own life had been shaped by strong women. His mother, who had taught him to respect all people regardless of gender; Delilah, who had shown him what true partnership looked like; and now his daughter, who was working to create a more equitable world for future generations. The 1920s brought continued prosperity to Jefferson and the Warren family. Ben's medical practice thrived. Thomas's veterinary business expanded to serve multiple counties, and Clara's legal work took her to Washington, D.C. for consultations with legislators. The grandchildren were growing up healthy and happy, and Fletcher took great joy in watching them develop their own personalities and interests. As Fletcher entered his 70s, his health remained good overall, though he tired more easily and needed more rest than he once had. Delilah, in her early 60s, remained active and engaged, though she had officially retired from the medical center in 1920, turning over operations to Ben and his partner. She continued to mentor young nurses and consulted on difficult cases, but her primary focus had shifted to writing and advocacy work for public health initiatives. On a cool autumn evening in 1925, Fletcher and Delilah celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary with a small dinner at their home, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. After the meal, Ben stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who have shown us all what real love looks like. Not the romantic fantasy of fairy tales, but the genuine partnership of two people who choose each other every day, who work through difficulties instead of running from them, who build a life together brick by brick, year by year. You have given us the greatest gift parents can give their children, the example of a loving, stable, committed marriage. Thank you for that." The room erupted in applause and affirmations. Fletcher looked at Delilah and saw tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, they sat together on the porch in the mild November air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the night was quiet except for the usual sounds of insects and distant animals. 43 years, Delilah said wonderingly. When you first asked to court me, I never imagined we would have this much time together, build this much together." "What did you imagine?" Fletcher asked. "Honestly, I tried not to imagine too much. I had learned the hard way not to count on the future, to just take things one day at a time." She paused. "But if I had allowed myself to dream, I could not have dreamed anything better than what we have had." "Neither could I," Fletcher agreed. "You exceeded every hope I had, every dream I was brave enough to dream." "We did well, did we not?" Delilah said, gesturing at the house, the land, the life they had built. "We took our broken pieces and made something whole." "We did," Fletcher confirmed. "And it was worth every moment, every struggle, every doubt overcome." They sat in companionable silence. Two people who had loved each other through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, who had built a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. The young man who had stood at an altar twice, waiting for brides who never came, was a distant memory now, a chapter in a much longer story that had ended in contentment and fulfillment. The young woman who had arrived in Jefferson with damaged luggage and uncertain prospects had become a pillar of the community, a pioneer in her field, a beloved wife and mother and grandmother. Together, they had proven that second chances were real, that healing was possible, that love, when it finally came in its right form, could transform everything. As the evening deepened into night, Fletcher thought about all the moments that had led them to this one. The chance encounter at the hotel, the dislocated shoulder that had brought them back together, the fear he had overcome to ask her to court him, the small wedding in Marcus's parlor, the births of their children, the challenges they had faced together. Each moment had been necessary. Each had contributed to the life they now lived. "Thank you for showing up," Fletcher said again, the phrase that had become his touchstone, his way of expressing gratitude for her constant presence. "Thank you for letting me in," Delilah replied, her own touchstone phrase, acknowledging the risk he had taken in opening his heart after so much pain. They stayed on the porch until the chill drove them inside, moving through their nighttime routine with the ease of long practice. As they lay in bed, Delilah curled against Fletcher's side as she had for 43 years. Fletcher felt complete. His life had taken unexpected turns, had included pain he would never have chosen, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. The woman had shown up. Not the first woman or the second, but the right woman. And in showing up and staying, in choosing him day after day for more than 4 decades, Delilah had finally made him believe. Believe in love, believe in marriage, believe in himself, believe in the possibility of happily ever after. And in believing, he had found it. Not because his life was perfect or without challenges, but because he had found the right person to face those challenges with, the right partner to build a life alongside, the right woman to grow old with. As sleep claimed him, Fletcher's last conscious thought was one of gratitude. For second chances, for late arrivals, for women who showed up and stayed, for love that healed old wounds and created new possibilities. For Delilah, always and forever for Delilah, the woman who had finally made him believe.